We have an actual literary scholar here with his microphone off now. Yeah, let's save it for the discussion.
I see. Sorry. Hello, hello. My mic was off. Hi.
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 So I'm not sure for her how long should we wait? Or yeah, people will just jump in at some point. Let's say 35, so 2 more minutes. Hi, Werner.
Oh, it's
Werner
awkward
is...
during the initial wait.
Sorry?
It's always awkward during the initial wait, wondering how long to give people.
Yeah, I was, this is my first time as a chair of such an event, so I have no experience. Is it common to wait for 5 minutes, or what would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it usually is. Yeah, so. And also the moderator, he had to let me in. I was waiting like for 3 or 4 minutes, so maybe there are some people in the queue still left, so we'll see.
Oh no, he was just waiting for me to say that it's open. Oh yeah, and I was instructed to tell you that by attending here, you agree with being streamed on YouTube, and that you will be your face will be seen later. Possibly, it will be saved on the departmental YouTube channel. So if you don't agree with it, you can turn your camera off, or you can move to the YouTube channel instead. Okay. So it's great that we can perhaps, yeah, this meeting is being recorded. We can keep it more personal in this small circle. So welcome everybody. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about complex but also very exciting relation between sociology and literature. Originally, the plan was to have sort of a cultural event for the conference, which would happen later in the evening in some of the local cafes. We would have literary reading, and we would compare it with reading of sociological texts, and then try to discuss what's the difference. And we would try to read sociological texts as poetic texts, as lyrical texts, and so on, and experiment with the form. But the current situation changed the rules drastically, but also it allowed us to have this amazing opportunity to connect Sydney and Amsterdam with Brno. So I will introduce our 2 amazing guests and speakers, Ashleigh Watson and Johana Kotišová. Ashleigh Watson is a sociologist of technology and fiction. She works at the University of New South Wales in Sydney as a postdoctoral fellow with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. There, she researches the social impacts of how automated decision-making and AI are imagined, designed, and implemented across contexts of health and well-being. She also researches the digital material spectrum of zine cultures and queer digital archival practices. Ash is author of the novel Into the Sea, which she wrote as a part of her dissertation thesis. The novel was published last year. This year, she co-authored a book, The Face Mask in COVID Times, and wrote on creative and digital methods under the circumstances of lockdown. Creative and arts-based methods are Ash's long-term interest. In 2016, she published an article, Directions for Public Sociology, Novel Writing as a Creative Approach, where she advocates for closer cooperation between sociology and literature to make social scientific text more engaged and more engaging. Ash published numerous fictional pieces. She is a creator and editor of So-Fi Zine, an indie publication for sociological fiction, poetry, and visual art. She is also fiction editor of the Sociological Review. So welcome, Ash. And Johana Kotišová works as Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at the University of Amsterdam. Before, she worked as assistant professor at the Department of Media Studies and Journalism at Masaryk University. She has a background in social anthropology, media studies, and holds a double PhD degree in sociology from the University of Liège and Masaryk University. Johana is author of the book Crisis Reporters, Emotions and Technology, and Ethnography, which explores European crisis reporters' emotional labor and professional ideology. This book is based on Johana's dissertation thesis, where she experimented with a method of creative nonfiction. She explores boundaries between social scientific and art-oriented genres and potentialities of their blurring. She did research on the role of new media in civic practices, digitization in the audiovisual industry, or semantics of aesthetic evaluation. Her current interests include crisis and conflict reporting, news workers' emotional labor, applied research, and creative research methods. So, and yeah, I am Jan Váňa. I'm currently waiting for my dissertation defense, which should happen in October. I submitted my thesis 2 months ago, and it's on a new research program in the sociology of literature, and I advocate for emancipation of literature in social scientific research. And that's also how I will start this session. I will try to feed you with some more theoretically and probably more scientifically based information before we delve into more art related part, as I think, at least. So let me share the screen with you. So I choose this maybe provocative title for sociology, the sociological truth of fiction, because I believe that in fictional texts we can find truthful in the sense of objective and useful and essential social knowledge, which is very often misused by sociology and is treated in a way which sort of misses a lot of important aspects of this social knowledge in literature. When I was writing my thesis at the conferences, I recognized that sociologists really love books. They talk about them a lot. Many sociologists wrote in their articles that reading literature is essential for understanding society, understanding conventions, civilization progress, understanding existential aspects of social life. For example, Austin Harrington wrote 2 articles on Robert Musil's Men Without Qualities, and many social scientists wrote on how useful literary fiction is for their research. I recognized 2 main categories in these writings. One I call existential understanding, and the other one representation of zeitgeist, which somehow overlap and intertwine in different social scientific texts. Here are just a few examples of excerpts from social scientific articles praising literature. But the relationship between sociology and literature has been rather complicated, and that's also probably one of the reasons, or as I claim, is one of the reasons why literature is treated as it is, as I will show later, because in the 19th century, literature was treated as this institution that had strong legitimacy for giving direction and sense for societies to orient their lives. And literature was able to analyze social dimensions of daily lives, but also to abstract and create archetypes. For example, Balzac, Honoré Balzac, is probably one of the most famous, and he tried to create social types in his books, and he several times he talked about his books as sort of a scientific endeavor to systematize societies and social milieus. And sociology competed with literature for this primacy in what discipline should be the dominant one in explaining explaining social life and providing directions for people. So sociology turned more scientific, and literature was left with this notion of culture of feelings, and as such was treated as less objective. And this, I believe that this notion persists till today, and we can see it in Marxist influenced research, in work inspired by Pierre Bourdieu, works on production and reading of literature, and so on. I distinguish sociological treatment of literature to two main categories. The one is interested about what is outside of the literature, and one about the insides of the literature. The first one is the one influenced by this idea that sociology and social sciences are more objective than literature, and therefore social sciences try to sort of transfer and transform these aesthetic and literary related categories into those which are more measurable and more accountable from the perspective of sociology. So sociology is interested in production of literature and reading of literature, and the social aspects of these processes. Here I have put several examples of the dominant schools, such as Pierre Bourdieu, British Cultural Studies, Art Worlds of Howard Becker, Sociology of Reading, Sociology of Cultural Meaning and Fabrication of Meaning by Wendy Griswold, and Cultural Sociology of Reading, which emerged recently, promoted by Angelika Tumala-Olave, for example, in American Journal of Cultural Sociology. Then, as I mentioned, sociologists also often look inside literature to find inspiration and to sort of admire literature's ability to grasp phenomena which might be evasive for perhaps more rigid social scientific methods and theories. Here I found three predominant categories. The one is oriented towards teaching sociology. The second one treats literature as a source of sociological imagination, looking at examples of social issues and sociological thinking. And the third one takes literature to sort of dig for new concepts and new perspective to look at societies. In the first category, looking from the outside of the literature, this middle part, the text itself, is usually omitted or treated as a black box. And these schools look at the production and reception. In the second part, I think the biggest danger of this, of treating literature by social sciences as inspiration and source of imagination, is something I call lyrical exceptionalism, which sort of believes that literature has something really deep and essential to tell us, but treats it very cautiously and as a sort of this mysterious and cryptic entity. And therefore, I think that the best and more rightful way to treat literature is to combine these two into the model, which I call the symmetrical one. And that takes into account all the context of reception and production, but also looks inside of the text. And through this, we can focus on the interaction between the text and the reader, where the both parts contribute to the creation of social knowledge in the symmetrical way. So we don't translate the text into sociological discourse, but we try to understand text in its own terms. But we also keep putting these aesthetic devices and dimensions inside their social context of production and reception, as is summarized in this diagram. So, and that's how I believe literature should be treated more rightly by sociology. And yeah, in this presentation, I actually twisted the title of the whole speech, because I talked about literature as sociology, not about sociology as literature, to show how this what is kind of it's blurry conceptualization, right? That it's not as easy to say sociology is somewhere distinct from literature, and if we want to make literature sociological, we have to somehow transform it or re-signify it. So that's all from me, and now I will pass the word to Johana. And I will, yes, stop sharing the screen. Okay, thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'll address the very important question of having fun with research, because I'll talk about creative nonfiction. My talk has two parts. In the first part, I will talk about my book that was published almost 2 years ago, and is written in the genre of creative nonfiction. And I'll also talk about the affordances of creative nonfiction. And in the second part, I will read a fragment from my current research that I believe fits into the same genre. First, a few words about the book. It is based on ethnographic research of European crisis reporters. It includes their quotes, my field notes, my interpretation, analysis, and it is a description of how crisis reporters become cynical because of their work. But this real world story is entangled with a fictional story of a fictional journalist, James, who travels to a fictional island to cover a fictional catastrophe. And the fictional story sort of frames the real world story. And these two layers, the fictional and the factual one, are entangled, interconnected, intertwined. And this is why I call it creative nonfiction. There are many borrowings, exchanges, and intersections between the factual literature and fictional literature, such as plotting and other novelistic devices. Take history, for example. History draws realism precisely from its narrativity. So what creative nonfiction does is that it more consciously and more deliberately works with these intersections and more consciously borrows the literary devices in order to enhance some aspects of the scientific quality of the texts. So how does creative nonfiction help? First, the form of the work can bear some of its arguments. In my case, I wanted to criticize the traditional, neutral, detached version of journalistic objectivity. So I wanted to turn away from its scientific counterpart. And the creative nonfiction was an obvious way how to do that. Second, it brings in metaphors. Here, the point is that academic inquiry is unable to capture the full complexity of reality. So metaphors enable us to address diverse issues in one single image. They allow us to express more complex meanings, tensions, alternative viewpoints, emotions, sensations, etc. Third, the messy ball of data that describe events, information, etc. that you have need to be ordered into a meaningful narrative with a beginning and an end, or into another structure that makes sense. And here the creative methods are very helpful, not only the linear, like creative nonfiction way of writing or sociological novel, but also poetry or drama. Fourth, creative nonfiction can make the research less boring, which is very important when you do participatory action research or public sociology, when you want to do something with your research. This argument is very well developed in Ashleigh's work. And finally, employing fiction in research brings in openness because it requires that you come to terms with the invented dimensions of your research. And that you come to terms with your own role in this process. There is an established link between thinking creatively and working ethically. But there are also some things that creative nonfiction makes more difficult or challenging, but we can talk about that later. If you're interested, you can download the book for free. It's open access. And I also published this paper on creative nonfiction as such. So this was the first part. And in the second part, I will read a short text that I wrote recently based on my current research. And the text is a beginning of my thinking about the conflict among the GDPR, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ethnographic practice and ethics. And I think we really need to look more especially into the conflict between the GDPR/ethics committee's requirements and actual ethics. It has an audio introduction. So.
Dear participant, you'll be taking part in the Fixers, Stringers and Foreign Crews. I consent to participate in the Fixers and Stringers research project. Yes or no? You can decide to stop taking part and to withdraw your consent to the research interview being recorded. If you decide to stop yes or no your consent, all the information gathered until then will be permanently deleted. I consent to take part in the follow-up research. If you have any complaints regarding this research, you can contact the Secretary of the Ethics Committee of the Faculty of Humanities. The researcher can contact me in the future in relation. If you think that the research participation could be harmful to you, you should not take part. I'll talk to you about how it feels to work as a fixer, stringer, or foreign correspondent. If your data My participation in the research project can put me at risk. Yes? No?
Your personal information may not be viewed by third parties without your
If you answered
permission.
yes, please specify the type of risk that you expect.
Hello, so I'm here. His voice sounds assertive. Hello, I'm here as well. I look and turn around to find him. It's harder with his face covered with a face mask, but I finally identify a silhouette that rings the bell with his left hand put up to hold a phone. I can see you. I wave, hang up, and cross the tram lane. He holds out his hand. I cannot refuse. I almost forgot how to do a handshake, and I like it. He pulls off the respirator. It is not mandatory right now to wear it outside, or is it? I do the same, thank him for his willingness to talk to me, and apologize for being on first-name terms with him on Messenger. Yes, Facebook Messenger, the thing that scares the ethics committees so much. That's how we've been in touch because naturally people first need to meet and do some small talk at some online platform, and only then they can contact each other by email. It doesn't matter, we can be on first name terms, he says, and breaks the new deal several times in the following 5 minutes. Are we heading to a park? I ask, excited about the very fact that we are meeting in flesh and blood. No, we are going to a pub. I'm relieved in a way. Quiet pubs and cafes are by far the best places for interviewing. I'm also scared. Although I've been more able to break rules since I started living on Pluto, having a partner on the moon and family on the Earth, I do not need to be fined for drinking beer in a pub that is officially closed. Especially not as I'm breaking all anti-COVID measures of the planet. I did not get tested before, after coming here, and I'm not staying in quarantine. How else could I conduct this interview and see the family? It turns out that my interviewee knows the bartender who apparently owns the pub. We order a beer and take a table. It's going to open soon anyways. He soothes my poorly hidden unease. I start pulling the information letter for research participants, 2 exemplars of the informed consent and a risk questionnaire, 5 pages in total, 2 pens and a voice recorder out of my backpack. I place the items on the good old sticky wooden table. Out of politeness, he restrains himself from rolling his eyes. Do I have to read it? He asks while looking at the 2-page information letter that I also sent him a few days in advance via a secure university contracted file sender. Well, I reply over the growing pub buzz while rummaging through the documents. I feel out of place. Luckily, my interviewee is very confident and cannot think of any risks that my research could pose to him, which makes my suffering shorter. I tick all 9 boxes for consent, with meeting me, with talking to me, with me talking to him, with the research participation, recording, transcription, follow-up research, the future research, and with me keeping his contact details. Heaven. Can you imagine some non-financial reward for the research participation? Is there something I could do for you? Anytime I articulate this question, I feel like a prostitute. Besides, we all know that what these media people need are money and rest. And without being an actual prostitute, I cannot help with any of these deficiencies. No, or actually you can give me contact to some fixers, he says. Fixers are locals living on Mars who assist foreign reporters coming to Mars to report on the latest developments on the planet. And that's what my forcibly casual conversation or research interview with this reporter is supposed to be about. All right, I'll note that, I reply, and the GDPR warning light in my head starts blinking. It's not going to happen, at least not officially, although the fixers would love it too. I say nothing. I haven't been in a pub for a week, the interviewee says after taking a generous draught. The pubs have been closed for some 7 years. During the interview, the pub gets crowded. Small groups of young English or French-speaking impatient walk in, take beers, and vanish. Only 2 or 3 men sit next to our table and threaten the clarity of the recording with their drunken quarrel. I just hope none of them has the Sigma variant, and my interviewee does not notice my inner panic. One of the drunks spills a whole chick-sized glass of beer, and the liquid reaches my coat. Do you want me to intervene? The interviewee asks. During the interview, my research participant gives me about 7 phone numbers of famous Mars reporters and reassures me I can use him as a reference. We talk and dream about traveling to war-torn places, Elysium, Mariner Valleys, Phobos. The bartender joins us from time to time for a chat. Another pair of beers lands on the table and I stop counting the many anachronisms. An encounter in person, a handshake, an open pub, a drunk spilling beer, a night, spontaneity, plans, a chat with a stranger, contact details and personal data that are shared without reservations. I go to the bathroom and give myself a happy, defiant grin, a terrestrial grin, a grin without a face mask. Hello, Pavlusha. Look, after we met, I wrote a kind of fictional fragment of something. There is not your name, no places, nothing. But still, I wanted to ask you whether you are okay if I publish it somewhere. I'd like to read it at a conference next week. And I can easily say that I invented the whole story. It's only 2 pages long. I'll look at it today, but I'm sure it's good. Thanks a lot. I'm curious because it's kind of biting. In that case, I consent in advance. Biting things are okay. Publish it and turn me into a hero. In conclusion, I want to say that the last sentence was, of course, ironic. Pavlusha is not that egocentric, but thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Johana, for your mixed methods presentation. And now I'll pass word to Ash.
Thanks, everyone. Can you see my screen okay? Great. This is just a website that I'm sharing with a couple of links to things that I'm going to talk about. So if you're watching this later on YouTube or you're watching it now and want to be able to click on the links, you can just go to the website, the URL at the top there. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I absolutely love talking about sociology and fiction. So it's really great to be able to do it today. So my background is in both sociology and creative writing. I kind of wrote as a child and was socially curious, but I think I officially came to them both about the same time when I was an undergraduate student. And I was studying literary studies and taking creative writing workshops. And I was also picking up electives in sociology. And to me, they both so naturally spoke to each other from the start. These disciplines that are often, within different departments in universities and kind of don't really have any idea what's going on in across the hall, even though sociologists and fiction writers and literary scholars, we are often really focused on the same kinds of things in the social world. We want to write about the same kinds of problems, pay attention to the same kinds of characters. So when I moved into my PhD project, I thought, well, kind of let me bring these together in the richest way that I think that I can. And as a part of my dissertation, I wrote a novel, which I will read a little bit from in a moment. This project, basically what I was interested in was the question of public sociology, and this kind of renewed call at the time, it felt like, for us to do better public sociology and to do more creative public sociology, and basically to attend to the social world in more careful and more attentive and more creative ways. So not just to produce things that people outside academia might like to read a little bit more, but also in the very way that we work from the beginning. So engaging with the people and the places that we research in some new ways. So in doing that, I brought together a kind of a sociological ethnographic method with a method of fiction writing, and the end result was a thesis that basically argued for kind of why we should take fiction seriously and arts-based research methods seriously more broadly. If we really want to be serious about this call and this kind of commitment of doing public sociology, not just as a product, but as an essential practice of the discipline. So I flesh out some of those early arguments. This was the first thing that I wrote actually while I was writing my dissertation as a student. So I'm really glad to be talking about it now. I flesh out some of those ideas in here and draw from some examples of novels that sociologists have written, as well as trying to, I guess, speak back to that history that you brought up already, Jan, about the kind of the historical divergence in the discipline when early sociologists were trying to separate them and mark themselves out, not just from the natural scientists of the time, but also of the literary writers. And I really see my practice as a kind of, not necessarily something new within the discipline, but as a return to a really important history of social research. How I went about doing the project is something that I unpack a little bit more in this paper, which is called Methods Breeding, and it's published in Sociological Research Online. This basically spells out and tries to open up a little bit so it's applicable to other people, the methodological approach I took in that project. So not necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of the specific methods, but a more kind of overarching design, a framework that I used for kind of what I did with my time and how much weight I gave to things. I'm finding your kind of recent work, Jan, on the symmetric approach really interesting, because this was something that I tried to, not in the same way, but I think in a similar vein, that I really tried to highlight with Methods Breeding. And that was how to actually put into practice this centering of creative practice, not just as something that we do once we've done our official proper research, as something that's great to do at the end of it in order to get our research findings out there, but as a way of actually seriously holding, creative work and literature together with sociological methods throughout the start of a project all the way through to the end of it. So this is a technique that, spells out how I went about that in my project, and hopefully is useful for other people, a bit of a general guide for people who are bringing together different methods. It's not specifically for people who are using arts-based research, but I have drawn from arts-based research in it. So I've tried to bring some of those creative practice insights and lessons and make them applicable for people, whether they're kind of just doing qualitative or quantitative or arts-based research, or mixing across the whole spectrum of different research methods out there. And I've extended on that work more recently. This is my most recent piece that came out at the start of this year. And it's in Qualitative Research Online. And in this, I reflect on my practice of writing my novel again. And I also draw in two other projects that were mentioned at the start. So the first is SoFi Zine, which is an indie publication that I started in 2017. You can read it for free on the website, which is just sofizine.com. there's also, I always make a DIY print version. So you can just print it on any printer and it will fold out in the right stack, and you can just lift it up and fold the pages together, and then you've got the publication all with all the layout right. So this is hopefully, you know, a home for people who want to write fiction and poetry and make visual art, not necessarily has to be from kind of their sociological research, but engages with those kind of key themes or key ideas, or tries to extend this disciplinary work in a creative way. Fiction at the Sociological Review is a similar series, similar in, I suppose, spirit. And this is a short story series, so for slightly longer pieces than I publish in SoFi Zine, and it's just for fiction. So in this, since 2018, this series has been running online on the Sociological Review's website. And they've recently redone the website and have really featured the fiction section, which is so excellent. Authors submit short stories of around 3,000 words. And with that, they also submit a 500-word exegesis, or kind of a scholarly explanation or unpacking, or just kind of a non-fiction discussion of the piece, of their writing process, or some of the ideas that are in it, or some of the research that it might be based on. So across all of those things, as well as method, I'm starting to try and think more carefully about some of those creative techniques and some of the key scholarly theories that we might use when we're doing this kind of creative work, and not trying to separate those out as two different things, but thinking about how practice and theory can really come together in this kind of work. So the two things I focus on in this article are poetics and aesthetics, which people in kind of hard sociology and hard fiction that don't speak to each other, you know, separately write about. And I've tried to bring those things together in theory and in practice. So that is a little bit of my background and some of the recent work that I've done and some of the ideas that I've been thinking about. I'm going to read now from a short section from my book, Into the Sea. It was published last year. It was a very strange publishing experience in the middle of a lockdown. I didn't get a hard copy of the book for ages, so it didn't feel real. Postage to Australia just takes an incredibly long time at the best of times. So in the pandemic, took months. But it's out in the world now. If you're looking for a copy, you can find it on the Brill website just by searching the title. I'd like to read a short part from the start of chapter 6. So the novel is set mostly in Sydney in Australia, which is where I live now, but actually I lived in a different city at the time. And it follows a group of young adults throughout 12 months of everyday life. So kind of through all the mundane and the extraordinary things that go on in people's lives. The young people are at an age where they kind of are starting careers or trying to start careers. They finish their university studies. They're kind of over that glow of youth age. They kind of just past the time of life where coming of age novels are set. They've come of age. They're in their mid-20s and they're kind of looking around saying, is this it? What's next? What is it that I want next? So in this, I bring together, it's essentially an experiment in sociological imagination. I really centrally draw on C. Wright Mills's key work. And I also bring together a couple of other big disciplinary themes and some philosophy from Spinoza as well to really think about social theory and affect and what it means to do sociological imagination as an everyday practice in everyday life, rather than something I sit down at my desk and do when I've got my work hat on. So chapter 6 is set entirely in an IKEA. I loved writing this chapter. I spent hours, if not weeks, in IKEAs to try and get it right. And I'll read a part of the introduction of this chapter now. The only way in is up. Up is the only way at all. From the dark car park to the shiny top floor fishbowl, a single escalator turns itself over to lift homemakers into the glossy dream. The entrance stands alone, a moth light for the flooding customers. There is no downstairs escalator along this edge of the building, nor any static cement staircases offering both up and downward movement. There's just one way to be moved. Park the car, pause mid-step for the electric sliding doors, ascend the quiet escalator. Keep your feet balanced between the yellow lines. Let the mess of real trees and sunlight behind the windows on the second floor you're bypassing disappear behind you. You're not allowed on that floor yet. Keep your face turned upwards. Stride off the escalator. Take a blue bag and a yellow trolley. Welcome to homemaking heaven. Welcome to IKEA. When the stair ride ends and the polished top floor opens up, you can press straight on ahead and plunge into the first series of model rooms, or you can hang a left and queue up at the restaurant cafeteria between the looping silver cordons with your disinfected tray. No matter the hour, this section of the floor always jams. Stumped by the need to make a decision so soon after the warm, responsibility-free up is the only way embrace, and the sudden noise and the other people and the baby always crying, the end of the escalator bottlenecks. There's a hesitation between the law of the first display and someone's suggestion that the food hall might be terribly busy later on. On Saturday, a young couple with a quiet toddler ascend into the scene. The father in a blue jumper and loose shorts, the mother with a high ponytail in black lycra and coral shoes, both with large takeaway coffees. She holds the child and he locates a large trolley and the kid is slid into the top seat, her grey dress and palm-sized pink shoes still in place. They don't hesitate at the first whiff of tepid salmon and potato, but push through a crowd of mothers and teenage daughters doing the now or later. The ponytailed woman presses a button on her black wristwatch, checking her commencing step count on the built-in pedometer, and they push the baby over the first floor arrow into a lounge room scene. Caleb and Taylor come in the afternoon, once they've eaten at home. They bickered after their last overindulgence on meatballs and mash and steamed veg and bread rolls and cider and jelly and hot chips. They agreed this time they'd be better off avoiding the blind haze that cheap feasting can bring on. Taylor's temper shortens and Caleb turns a spendthrift. Last month, they bought 2 water jugs and a woolen blanket and 3 cardboard magazine holders that are too small for anything except those expensive A5 zines. They're now flattened in the hallway cupboard with some potentially usable batteries and a knot of cables. The jugs are still in their plastic wrap, but the blanket at least hangs over the back of the lounge. It's unraveled at nighttime and neither of them can be bothered to walk into the next room for socks. At the top of the escalator, Caleb takes a yellow bag off the rack and they move on. The first section signed Living marks the inner entrance. They follow the floor arrows through the 6 main mock-up areas: living, dining, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and outdoors. There are smaller spaces within these, and downstairs is a free-for-all, covering everything from light bulbs to soft closed drawers, but the top floor is what the crowds come for. The apartments and little houses, the stylized rooms you don't just walk through but sit inside, lounge room to lounge room and mid-century to Scandi to Art Deco, drawing yourself into each one, like trying different jackets before a change room mirror. Thank you. I'll leave it there and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
I'll clap my hands with the microphone on. Wow, okay, yeah, that was amazing. Thank you both for the reading. I have to say, I was really immersed. And I mean, I already have questions popping up in my head, but okay, let's do it according to how we thought about it originally. So we thought that to break the sort of hierarchy between the chair and the discussants, each of us would prepare questions for the others too, and we would create sort of this discussion circle. But yeah, what I want to emphasize now is that everybody, of course, can ask questions, and you should do it. You can either write it in the chat box, or you can just, I mean, it's so few of us that you can just basically talk, I guess. And on YouTube channel, there is supposed to be a chat box, which I can't really find. So I don't know how it works there. But yeah. Yeah, if Tomáš will send me a question from the chat box, then I will include it. We'll see. So my first question goes to Johana, and I will do it this way. So yeah, we prepared the questions in advance. So what decisions did you make to render your thesis acceptable for the academic audience? Did you have to sacrifice formal experimenting for the sake of better clarity, or it never occurred to you? In your paper on creative nonfiction, you mentioned challenges when employing different genres in social scientific texts. One of them is that social scientists usually lack training to interpret aesthetic aspects of texts. You refer to the idea that they should be more aware of how texts affect them emotionally. Don't you think these turns toward emotions and aesthetics might devalue social sciences among other sciences and in the eyes of general publics? So
yeah, thanks for these questions. Thanks for these questions. I have to say that at the time of writing, my intended audience was formed by my research participants and media professionals that I speak about in the book. So I have to admit that I was strongly convinced that I was saying something that people should read. So I did not care that much about the academic audience. And I was aware that it was very tricky. And it was finally surprising to me how first my supervisors and then the manuscript reviewers actually liked it. And the manuscript reviewers wanted deeper fictional characters. So the adjustments that I did were centered around adding more fiction, actually, adding personal history to my character, etc. Then one of the reviewers suggested that I didn't deal enough with the seminal white male authors, so I added some 2 pages of criticism. And the editor wanted signposting, so I added some references to other chapters, etc. So I never sacrificed, experimented. It was quite the opposite. And as for the devaluation, I think that anything can devalue social sciences among other sciences and general public. But I think that rather than the introduction of aesthetics and emotional criteria that after all fit into philosophy and psychology, it is the very blurring of boundaries between art and science that can seem non-scientific to people who want to see social science as non-scientific. But I'm more worried about internal struggles within sociology and among sociologists, actually, and among social scientists. And I think it's good to first pay attention to our own openness to the other science and to acknowledge that if a scientist wants to cheat and invent findings, then writing sociological novels or creative nonfiction is by far the least efficient way how to cheat, because it takes a lot of energy.
Okay, thank you. So, so you think that this is sort of a subversive or revolutionary behavior through which you try to fight this for aesthetics inside of social sciences? That takes your energy.
Yeah, I think it's not that revolutionary, actually. It has a long tradition in social anthropology, at least. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Want me to follow with my questions, or?
I will follow with the question to Ash. Oh yeah, you mentioned the methods braiding. So according to it, it seems to me that the creative process is perpetually checked and held under control to fulfill the desired aims. In your thesis, you provide a sort of literary critique of your own fiction. So how do you prevent these reflective mechanisms from making your text overly calculated and dull? Can you describe how you balance the creative and more rationally oriented dimensions of writing? And this relates to the other part that regards the reception. So who is the implied reader of your novels? Do you adapt your writing style to reach the major public in order to fill the principles of public sociology? And how to disseminate socially engaged and sociological literature outside of the already educated bubble? That's what I'm most interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked this question, especially the first part. It's something I really wrestled with this while writing the book and undertaking the research project. I think a part of why I wrote the methods braiding paper was, I guess, because of the lessons I learned along the way about how hard it is to balance, you know, scholarly practice and creative practice when you know that you have a very specific audience that you're trying to please in the first instance, you know, your dissertation examiners, but while being conscious of that, you know, not wanting to lose sight of the bigger project, the kind of, hopefully it turns into a novel, like a printed novel, which thankfully mine has, that it might reach new readers, that it becomes a story that exists outside, you know, out in the world, rather than just something that only sits within a dissertation and is only kind of for a dissertation. So yeah, it was something I really struggled with, actually. I think in the beginning of the project, I definitely ran the risk of overcooking the thinking that went into the book and the planning that went into the book. I actually wrote about the first third of it in first person as the protagonist that's in the book now. But I found that in her head, I actually couldn't see the end of the novel with all the planning that I'd done and, you know, the key themes that I wanted chapters to be about and the kind of intended audience that I had imagined for the book. And it wasn't until I let go of being inside her head, actually, I had the realization that kind of, why would she have this great, vivid sociological imagination? She wouldn't. She's a primary school teacher. She's never studied sociology. She's never engaged, you know, in any kind of, you know, in any long-term way that, you know, the privilege of studying sociology as an undergraduate lets you do. So it wasn't until I kind of stepped outside her and invented the character of the narrator who told the story that I could kind of see the end of the book. So I totally rewrote the first third of it. And once I'd done that, I could see the rest of it. And in doing that process as well, I had to come to the confidence of saying, well, I've done this planning. I know what the big kind of sociological themes are that I'd like to hit. In order to write the book, I need to almost forget all of that. I had to kind of put it away and not try and write to a plan because otherwise it wouldn't, you know, the prose didn't work. The story didn't work. It didn't feel realistic. It definitely felt over-calculated in those early drafts. So I think a lot of that for me was came down to finding the right style for the story, the kind of narration that it needed, where I could, you know, really speak to the themes without trying to directly engage them. The last kind of big edits of the novel that I did was actually stripping out a lot or almost all of the direct sociological exposition. So, you know, I'd have these extra paragraphs in where the narrator would try and explain something in too much detail, even, you know, using metaphors and you know, a literary way of doing it. But I just, you know, kind of after I was coming to the end of the project and I had much more confidence in how I could convey a sociological sense overall in the story rather than having to tell someone to make a point, you know, to show what the point was in that particular scene. Yeah, I was able to strip so much of that out of it. And I'm really happy, I guess, stylistically with the end result in how it doesn't do that too overtly. The implied reader for the novel, so I guess there is a primary audience that I imagined, which is kind of introductory sociology students, whether that's at an undergraduate level or kind of an adult reader who, you know, just hasn't studied sociology, or a high school student. Part of that was it gave me somebody to write for and a kind of like a background of prior knowledge that I knew I was writing for. it also kind of tied into the fact that this was a part of a dissertation project. So it very much, the intended audience very much came into the scholarly arguments that I was making about public sociology. The last part about how to disseminate this outside the educated bubble is an excellent question, one that I'm grappling with now that the book's out in the world. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody has any advice. I'd really like it. Yeah, I guess trying to publicize it through teachers first of all, and through my academic networks, and then yeah, trying to find book clubs and writing circles who, you know, have nothing to do with academia is been my approach so far.
Okay, thanks a lot. I will have a few follow-up questions later on. So now I will ask Johana to ask her questions.
I'll start with my question to you.
Yeah, I mean the whole round.
Yeah.
And of course, if some of the guests, other participants have something, they can, now they have space to intrude. But if not, please.
So my question to you, Jendo, is based on your arguments that cultural sociologists should be sensitive to the subtlety and ambiguity of meanings mediated by the aesthetic, that there are overlaps of fiction and sociology, and that the aesthetic experience actually enables communication. So this is a powerful set of arguments, I think. And I think it doesn't need to be limited to cultural sociologists, but can be extended to social scientists in general. At the same time, I can see a lot of passion in your work. So I want to redirect your argument to your own work and to ask you, how do you, in your own texts, work with aesthetic devices, your own emotions, and the emotional engagement of the readers?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Obviously, you know that I also write fiction, and I try to write socially engaged fiction. So this influences also how I write my academic texts. But actually, what I want to stress is that how it happened that my texts, at least according to what the readers tell me so far, seem so maybe passionate or engaged, or that they are not dry, that I learned from the American academic writing, not from fiction. So when I received my first reviews to the articles for Cultural Sociology Journal, Sociology Compass, and then American Journal for Cultural Sociology, quite several times I got a recommendation to include something which one reviewer called punchy line in the conclusion, or something like straightforward summary of your work. And that's what I really love about American writing style, to make your arguments clear-cut, concise, and of course it might be very rich and complex, but that's part of the, you know, part of the guts. But you always have to, and that's also what Werner keeps telling me all the time, you always have to have something introductory and conclusive, which is powerful, and which and that's what I like in writing my personal style in academia, that it should be clear what's the meaning of the text. I don't write to earn the impact factor, you know, to polish my CV, but that I want to change something. I want to change something in thinking of other academics. I want to influence something. And that's why I'm passionate about it. And partially it's intentional, but I think what I have to do more intentionally is to keep myself from being too passionate. So yeah, one of the first recommendations I got from Phil Smith from Yale was to button up, which I didn't know what it meant. So I had to look up this idiom, and then I learned I have to be more serious for academic texts.
Can I have a quick follow-up here, despite the fact that that Ash and Johana should also, I think you should kind of complete your circle. But it's kind of interesting, I found your answer interesting, because it kind of avoids the kind of aesthetic dimension of the text to some extent. Or you kind of refer to something that is kind of typically academic, concise punchlines, summaries. So the kind of qualities, literary qualities, and probably this was also the direction of Johana's question, seem not to be really reflected in your own academic writing. But maybe this is also because you also seem to, in some sense, you question, of course, the opposition of literature and sociology, as also Ash does. But at the same time, you also, there is a gap in your theorizing. The literature is something different. It communicates in a different way knowledge than sociology. And it seems that in your kind of very academic writing, you kind of reproduce this opposition in a certain way. Yeah. And my question would also be what do you take from your sociological writing into your literary writing, and how do you kind of bridge this gap? I mean, it's interesting that Ash, for example, which I loved her reading, and I think it was a great advertisement for the book. I would definitely get it. And what was interesting is this that the sociological explanations that you had in the text, but then you kind of cut them out. But this would have been my question also to you. To what extent were they necessary for your writing process? I often find myself writing in article stuff that I already know that I will delete, but I need it for myself to do it. So yeah, but pushing it back to you, Yanda, how do you, are there lessons, or is there something to learn from sociology when you want to write sociological fiction? A lot of good sociological fiction was not written by sociologists, so maybe it's unnecessary.
Yeah, I think this is basically part of my biographical path with writing fiction, that I started to be more interested in writing fiction only when I started to study sociology, because I always wanted to write fiction, but I sort of lacked the interesting, complex material which would somehow excited me and which would drive me to keep writing. And when I started to learn sociology, that gave me a new perspective on so many things that I just thought, wow, now I can write basically about anything, and it becomes interesting only because you see the influences of these daily situations and abstract systems and so on and so on. So yeah, it's very much influenced, and it's probably the reason I write, studying sociology. Yeah, okay, thank you, very interesting comment. Yeah, let's go on. I don't know if we should be strict with our time management. Perhaps not. We can, I don't know if we can keep the room, but yeah, let's go on.
So I'll follow with a question for Ash. It's a very down-to-earth question, and it's related to my own experience with the reception of my own way of writing by a part of the sociological audience, because I've heard like different kinds of criticism, such as this is not sociology, this is not science, you're hiding behind fiction, how can we know that you did not invent the data when you invented the story, etc. And Ash has a very extensive experience with publishing fictional genres, and the set of arguments by which you, Ash, supports novel writing as a form of public sociology is very persuasive. But at the same time, it implies something that my experience also proves, that sociology still needs to be persuaded to accept these semi-fictional genres as legitimate genres of sociological writing. So my question to you is, what, if any, is your experience with this type of criticism that I mentioned, and where do you see the place of sociological novel writing within the current systems of funding and evaluation of sociology? Is the writing of novels or short stories something that we need or we can do besides the conventional academic overproduction? Or do you see it as a possible integral part of what academics are paid for?
Thanks. This is, yeah, I mean, they're big questions, aren't they? On the first part of the criticism, I have definitely had very similar experiences. So when I started my PhD, the very first conference, like proper conference that I went to, I think I was about 4 or 5 months into my project. I went, I was very nervous. I had a whole script printed out for my talk and read out the whole thing, and then shared a part of my fiction in progress. And the very first question that I got was not a question. It was a comment from somebody who said, this sounds lovely, but it's not sociology. And I thought, I don't know how to possibly respond to this. Okay, great. I'm 4 months in. It's the very first question, not a question that I get at a disciplinary event. I think I'd said in my response, I'd say the same thing now. Well, it is like, it might not be a traditional way of working, but there are really significant historical roots of this kind of practice within the discipline. I think the practice of writing in a literary style, if not a fictional style, is entirely at the heart of so many social science disciplines, especially those where ethnography is a really prominent research method. So I suppose that I've experienced less of that criticism as I've kind of gone on over the years. And I've definitely seen more acceptance of this kind of work through my own projects and the kind of reception that they've had, and the people that I've connected with who are keen to start writing or are keen to, do more writing of this kind. And also definitely through things like the Sociological Review, reaching out to me, being very keen to start a short story series. Those are kind of excellent developments in the past few years. So we can see how fiction writing, but also creative methods more broadly, I think are really gaining ground at the moment. So I think it's a positive trend for people like us who are really passionate about this kind of work and would, very much like it to be core business. I think increasingly also it's a practice that can be folded into more traditional research projects in terms of funding, and in terms of publishing, and in terms of how we engage participants in data collection, and then what we do with our time as academics. So I know in a couple of projects that I've been involved in recently, in funding applications and in like ethics committee applications to get the project off the ground, I have done work where I've engaged participants in writing short fiction or in various kinds of creative activities. And they're things that we've built into the project with other more traditional creative research methods. So kind of with participant observation or with, semi-structured interviews. It's kind of a creative extension of the core qualitative work. That's the way that I found the most success in my own work. And it's definitely something I've noticed in some of the publications that I've seen come out recently, where kind of on top of interviews, researchers have themselves fictionalized from those to create short vignettes rather than findings in an article. And more of the big journals are starting to publish this kind of work more regularly. There was always a bit of it floating around, but there seems to be a bit more of a critical mass building up at the moment. So I do think it's becoming more accepted as you know, a standard and good and desirable academic practice. But in my experience, it's definitely still something that I fold into more traditional approaches. Is all of that kind of non-traditional type work.
Can I have a question for Ashleigh? Ash, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
No, you're right.
Can I interrupt the course of the discussion? So I get one comment and one question for Ash. I think that one of the ways that the let's say literary or somehow aesthetic writing was had been incorporated into sociology and the neighboring disciplines was the kind of writing we can find in Georg Simmel, in Adorno and his like fragments and so on. So like it also the question, or what is important, is how does sociology and the neighboring disciplines look like today, or what are expected from them? So perhaps some inspiration can be drawn also from what in some languages is called essay, but in English, of course, it doesn't work. But it's a kind of writing that is let's say more literary to put it. Or there's an aesthetic side to it, the style, and also the let's say some narrative perhaps aspect to it. So okay, Simmel, Adorno, but also Sartre, like and experimenting with drama, like it's more philosophical, but it also is related to let's say thinking about society. So that's my comment. And my question for Ash would be, she said that she what she does in her novel is not entirely new, that there's a tradition, of course, of let's say this mutual feeding from theory or from sociology to literature. So I would like to ask, are there any precedents, are there any authors that inspire you in this way? And my second related question would be, how do you feel, or where do you find the difference between your sociologically informed or sociologically oriented fictional writing and what is written like in general, like today's novels and so on? If there's some difference or something that is different from other fiction that is written nowadays. So that would be my two questions.
Thank you. Excellent. Excellent questions. Yeah, I mean, you're right about the kind of essayistic and literary style of writing that, you know, there are so many classic examples of. I think it's promising that it seems like a few book publishers are definitely really more keen for that kind of narrative-based work. Some of the books that have inspired my own work, I actually did a talk on this last year where I shared all of the novels that I read while writing my novel, which I kept track of, in my Goodreads app, and some of the key texts that I thought others should read if they want to get a more historical sense of the discipline. So one of those, some of the more contemporary ones. So I think Patricia Levy's work is definitely very dominant in this area. She's a prolific writer. She's written a whole series of social fiction novels. She's also, or was the editor of Brill's social fiction series, which is a series that my book is published in. One of those, for instance, is American Circumstance. That was a book that I found really inspiring, and the kind of other themes that it handled and how those themes were kind of worked out in the microcosm of characters' lives. There are a couple of others. So I think the Mind and Body Shop is a really interesting one. So that's written by Frank Parkin, who's who I believe was a criminologist in the UK, but the mind and body shop of the novel, it's a campus novel, and it's set in a dystopian future where the philosophy, all of the departments, but it's focused on the philosophy department, have to have a commercial output in order to, sustain their academic work. Hence the mind and body shop is the philosophy department's output. Something that is really interesting that I like about this book is the ways that it gets so many things right about the current state of higher education, but then the very material ways that it gets it wrong. So it is all about the kind of hyper consumerism that infiltrates the academic system, which we definitely feel here in Australia. But the way that he imagines it is, he has this great scene of students having to pass through a turnstile in order to get to the lecture room that they have to put coins in. And so, their pockets are dragging heavy with coins in order to get into all of their rooms. So that's another book that I love for the kind of clever and funny ways that these big issues resolve in the students' lives. A couple of other writers have written really excellent sociological fiction. I think Ursula Le Guin is a great writer for that very ethnographic style of work. Interestingly, her father, I believe, was an anthropologist, and growing up, she would kind of go to work with him and kind of learn from his, his ethnographic craft. And I think that definitely comes through in the very ethnographic style of fiction that she writes. And Zora Neale Hurston's work also, for that reason, I think is an excellent example of ethnographic fiction, ethnographic style fiction that I really love.
Sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but the difference, or are there any differences, or what is the specificity of your writing compared to like those who don't intend, or who are not associated with the sociological way? Or I mean, nowadays, because I take it as a kind of experimental fiction in a way, like or specific type of writing, like very theory loaded. So.
I guess, so something that I noticed, one of the key differences that I think, and I noticed this was a question that's come over from YouTube as well, is for me, one of the big things that I've noticed that's a difference between, say, literary fiction and what sociological fiction writers do, is it comes down to two things, and then the two areas where I really try and focus my kind of aesthetic and stylistic work to try and do what I was talking about before with trying to, kind of evoke sociology throughout the story rather than have these moments of exposition in the narrative. One is at the very micro level of the sentence, and it's, I've talked about it in some other areas as a poetic. And I think what having a sociological background and social theory can bring to a story is different kinds of metaphors and different kinds of essentially just different words for description and different words to kind of set a scene. So I don't know, the different language that I use to talk about groups of people, for instance, in my novel, the specific language that I use when I kind of talk about people at a party, or talk about a group of strangers, or talk about, groups of people in a shopping centre, there's specific words that I've drawn from social theory. So I guess that's at a sentence level where I've tried to bring that in, and that kind of, that sentence level description type language choice is a difference that I've noted between sociological and literary fiction. The other one is a really big one for me. So the other big difference is, I think, about narrative structure. Something that I am frustrated by in more traditional literary fiction is, even when big social issues are the centerpiece of the story, there's still a tendency to individualize at the end of the narrative in order to provide some kind of satisfying conclusion that, relates to the characterization arc that's happened throughout the story. Something that I think sociological fiction writers do really well is resist this individualizing impulse. It often means that the conclusion feels different. The structure kind of works itself out differently. There's no kind of there's no satisfying or neat bow tied on the end of a story. So they're the kind of things that I tried to do in my work. Yeah, both at sentence level and then specifically the narrative structure of how a story comes to an end.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would use this opportunity to jump in because this is what came into my mind when Ash talked about the implied reader of her novel, and it very much relates to this question. So if sociological and not sociological writing of a novel differs in style and narrative structure and so on, and I was quite surprised that you said that your implied reader would be introductory sociology student or students who, for example, have course introduction to sociology, someone who is becoming familiar with sociological thinking and maybe can use this as an opportunity to become familiar with it in more non-direct way. But isn't this a possible obstacle from practicing the public sociology in the sense to disseminate it to publics, not to students? You know, that this is, if you think of the style, when you write the fiction as influencing it for the sake of creating or making it comfortable reading for students, then it might create this obstacle for broader public, and then it goes kind of against the public sociology idiom. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I suppose in what I was talking about before, and when it comes to the question that you asked as well about process, I guess while I wrote the first few drafts of the novel with this specific kind of introductory sociology reader in mind, I think the key part of that for me was imagining that somebody is coming to sociological learning with no prior background of experience in the discipline at all, and what the key ideas are and ways of thinking are. But then in the work that I did to try and strip out all of that exposition in the final drafts of the book, I really tried to make the book stand on its own feet, and that it wouldn't have to be read kind of in a sociology introductory course, that it wouldn't have to be read kind of with this other kind of, with any paratexts really, with any other kind of curriculum that it needed to sit in dialogue with to kind of, you know, make the points that I hoped that it could make. Exactly, and that exactly was a process, like you said, when I could not have written the final version of the book in the first go. It was definitely a key part of the writing process, getting all of that thinking into the book itself, not just down on the page and, you know, onto a separate page, but into the manuscript draft itself. In order to then strip that out, so hopefully it, you know, is applicable for a wider public. I think the introductory student reader is also a safer imagined audience for me. The kind of broader general public seems, I don't know the avenues to kind of just broadly disseminate a novel that's not kind of published by a giant house and comes with a heap of advertising material. So yeah, even just in terms of kind of actual avenues for dissemination, that's one, that feels more safe and makes a lot more sense to me.
Okay, so now you also stress the influence of the production context and all the decision makers and so on. So I got a comment from our technician that we should answer perhaps the question from YouTube, but it was partially, answered, but we can do it more explicitly. So what do you think is the advantage of sociological fiction vis-a-vis just fiction, given how deeply and powerfully it can capture the social world? And it goes for Johana as well as for Ash. So maybe Johana, if you can answer first.
Yeah, I think that Ash has already answered a lot, but I would add maybe one more dimension, which I think is a core thing. because sociological fiction is still based on some kind of scientific knowledge, right? Some kind of data research, which is sometimes also the case of just fiction that is based on thorough research of something. Like when you take, for example, it's not just fiction, but this whole tradition of long reportages is also based on like thorough knowledge of the field. But I think that this is a criteria that the sociological fiction needs to fulfill. Actually, that it's based on rigorous data. Yeah, so that's one more dimension that is different, I think.
Yeah, well,
yeah, and I'll just say, I think because of that, Johana, I think it can say different things about the social world, that, you know, we know that kind of sociology is a discipline because it produces unique and important knowledge about the social world. I think that kind of just fiction can engage with many of the same issues and kind of highlight the same issues, but perhaps not provide that same lens or that same approach or that same way of seeing the social world. I think that's one of the key differences for me.
Yeah, there's a saying in Czech, to nevymyslíš, meaning you can't invent this, which is the case of sociological fiction, because the reality is sometimes like much more absurd and complex and surprising than fiction.
Okay, Werner has a question.
Yeah. Maybe just, yeah, I have a question for Johana. And I was wondering why you choose the descriptor creative nonfiction, because what you actually do is a kind of hybrid format of fiction and nonfiction. Because one could argue that creative nonfiction doesn't have to involve, can be academic writing, can be authors that simply kind of in a very poetic way write about their own autobiographical experience. So I find this really interesting also what you said about fiction, that it actually can also enhance realism and things like this. So I would like you to ask about this word choice, or this choice of your approach. And the second question is also this of your reading, this kind of interplanetary context of this interview situation. Why did you choose this? Was it for sake of kind of estrangement and anonymization? Because, and I'm an ardent reader of science fiction. From a science fiction perspective, it's in some way this fictional setting is very unrealistic, because of the time that it needs to get to Mars, and you wouldn't have this kind of COVID issues. It's like New Zealand, but it's like even farther away, and very kind of sealed off. You have kind of a very controlled artificial environment, which would make it a dream for every kind of technocratic government of such a colony to kind of combat a pandemic. So I find this from a science fiction perspective, it's not very realistic, but I was wondering why you choose it. Oh.
Maybe I'll first answer the second question. It was just to stress the distance that was created by the pandemics, but it was just an immediate idea, and I wanted to also further fictionalize the whole piece. Because obviously I didn't move to Pluto, but to the Netherlands, and my family lives on the Earth, but they also live in Czechia, so that was why. And as for the second question, I think that choosing this label was because it has already been used by someone else, and I actually lacked. That there is not enough dictionary for, not enough language for this, right? So I do not write sociological novels because it really has this standard aspect with references, standard layer of references and theory and etc. So I think it was just, I just chose one of these labels that seemed the closest to what I was actually doing, rather than inventing some new label myself. Yeah, but you're right that it's more of a hybrid form. Yeah.
Because it has these fictional, I mean, a lot of fictional aspects, but that's also a common thing in, for example, anthropological works, right? Because you condense a lot of findings in these fictional archetypes and so on.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. But I think this doesn't. I think it still fits into the label creative nonfiction because it's nonfiction. It is based on a real study, but there is this fictional layer that makes it creative, or that can be thought of as something creative.
But the character was made up, so it's fiction. It's creative, you know?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I might jump in with my question for you, Johana, because it's also about style. So I think that it relates to what we're already talking about. So, you know, as we've just been talking about, you kind of you don't just bring together fact and fiction in your book in a very literal sense. You also blend the styles, so the style of the novel and the styles that we'd find in an academic monograph. Your chapters have academic sounding titles, you reference throughout in quite traditional ways, and you make a scholarly argument, but also the book has a plot. There's characterization throughout, there's dialogue and settings. It's a story from the start to the finish. So I want to know, what is it about the subject matter that made the style work? And this question only comes from a place of absolute awe, because I experimented with a style very similar to this when I was starting to write my novel, and I just couldn't make it work. It didn't suit my story or the kinds of characters that I had, or it didn't really suit the way that I wanted to write. It's a very difficult style. So I'd love to just hear you speak more about kind of why and how your book came together in this way.
Well, I'm happy if it seems working. So thank you. The first, I think it has something to do with the fact that in my mind, like the border between different modes of expression is porous, and I really enjoy jumping from one mode of thinking to another one and then back. So the fictional story was a very obvious way to express things that were a part of the ethnography, but that I couldn't express by the traditional scholarly way of thinking and writing. And second, I didn't think it through that much, and I did relatively little editing in the writing process. I wrote the things that I invented together with, and among those that were real, it was very intuitive and based on improvisation. Anytime I felt that the scholarly argument was potentially entangled with some element of the fictional story, I just took a fictional breath, wrote a fictional scene, and then went on. And the third thing is that if you look at my conventional research papers, even these are very narrative and very simple. I'm trying to keep it very simple. So I use almost journalistic language. So there's actually not a wide gap between my scholarly writing and the rest. So there is actually nothing to cross, not much to cross. So I think what enabled this attempt to make the style work was first my general way of thinking and writing, and the practical integration of the fictional and the factual writing. Yeah.
Thanks. I think something that really struck me as well in your book was the inclusion of your handwritten notes. I thought this was amazing. The first page that I came across them on, it's, you know, it's when books are published and put together, we're still kind of removed from the author. We never see something as personal as somebody's handwriting. That seems such an awesome way to me of also kind of bridging that, you know, very edited and tight academic argument writing and, you know, the fictional breath that you talk about. Yeah, it's such an amazing way to think about it. Yeah, the blend also of your handwriting, I think just, yeah, it's a very, very exciting style.
Thank you. And this is also related to the data, because the handwriting, I believe it was on an issue of Le Soir, which is a Belgian newspaper issued right after the terror attacks on the 22nd of March 2016. So it kind of like was again entangled with the data and with the real world study.
Amazing. Given that we're now also on process, Jan, I might ask my question of you. How does that work?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Go on.
Yeah, so I guess my question for you is one about process and about method. So in the recent article that you published in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology special issue, you proposed a model for a literary turn in cultural sociology. And very usefully, this is not kind of an abstracted model, but one that you really illustrate through an analysis of fiction, as you do in lots of your work. But I'd really love to hear you expand upon the model in relation to the work, or kind of comparing the work that's done by literary scholars. So my question is, what is distinct about the literary turn that you propose in terms of actual process compared to other scholars who also really take fictional texts and literature seriously? And how does your work kind of sit, I suppose, between a sociological method that, as sociologists, we're much more familiar with, and then those methodological approaches that already come from literary studies?
Yeah, thank you. This is a brilliant question, because basically it took me about 4 to 5 years to read a lot of books on literary studies to decide that 95% of them are not really of use for me, because they just focus so much inside of the books. And and also part of the argument is to pay a lot of attention to the paradigm I'm part of. So I need to speak to the sociologists. And of course, Josef Šebek is here. And in just 2 days, we will be able to hear, unfortunately in Czech, his argument on that social context is essential for understanding literature, right? And my argument is just the opposite, because I make it for the sociological audience, but he makes it for the literary scholars, and the emphasis is very different according to different paradigms. So I tried to, so to speak, pick up certain schools and paradigms which I found closest to this interactional and dynamic process of what happens between the author and the production chain, the book, and the reader. And I started with the reception school of the Konstanz reception school of phenomenology, Wolfgang Iser and Jauss, and gradually it brought me to structural aesthetics and to Roman Jakobson, and then to Prague School. And as I went deeper and deeper in the particular text, I found out that what they actually were doing started in 20s and up to 50s, 60s, and so on, was something as sociology of literature as I wanted to do it now. So I'm sort of reviving the structural aesthetics of Prague School, which is labeled as literary scholarship, not as sociology, even though they have several texts where sociology is explicitly mentioned. Or Josef might correct me afterwards. And I try to put these old, very clever methods into the context of contemporary sociology. And yeah, I attended a literary conference once, and I was just struck how most of the presentations were closed so much inside of the books. And when I tried to ask about, okay, but what about why it's so important to know every single detail of this author, and what was the table where he wrote the book and so on, to understand the meaning of the book, it seemed to me very often as a fetish, as something, yeah. So, and they didn't like my presentation, obviously, because I abstracted the genius of the author and pushed it somehow. I made the author just this entity, the meaning entity, and not someone who channels the sacred text. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered you, but yeah, tried to. Maybe it was too broad of an answer.
So I won't comment on it like extensively. I just want to say that exactly these two points of view, even though literary theory, literary scholarship, and sociology are not, of course, something unified. It's also diverse, like extremely diverse, both of them. So it can even be a some kind of perspectival mistake to say there are these two views. But anyway. When you attended the conference on literature, perhaps that really somehow emerged those two those two points of view, and I think it's really very exciting. It's a really very exciting work to try to integrate the two points of view, but it's also very difficult because of because of in both fields, certain problems are very discussed, very much elaborated, and the other field sometimes tends not to see the differences and all the problematics, and try to make it let's say work, and in a way just to proceed with the research. So I think that this is really important. I just one more comment. Of course, what we are talking today, what we are talking about today is in effect a slightly different paradigm. I don't know if a new paradigm, but slightly different paradigm when you have like a fiction as an agent in sociological sense, like when you really have this experimental fiction and this very close relation of fiction and scholarship or sociology. But then in literary theory or literary criticism, the main or the dominant way to conceive of the relation of the literature and the social is, of course, the question of Jan has mentioned the question of determination, the question of base and superstructure, the question of hegemony, all these things. Like, how do the two relate? You know, is there a determination in the direction from the social world to literature, or what's the relation? So that's the traditional question that has been haunting literary criticism for a very long time, and it seems it has not been resolved, although there are many ways, many important pieces of scholarly work. And so for me, it's very refreshing to talk about it differently, like today, because this ghost of determinism and all these things is not very pressing us very much today. So.
Does anyone want to react? So yeah, I just want to say
I'll just say thanks. I'll just say thanks, Joseph. It's a really interesting perspective to hear. And yeah, I mean, you're so right that there's not kind of uniform disciplinary ideas about method or where fiction sits and how we should approach it. Yeah, but thanks so much. It's really interesting to hear what you're talking about.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that's why I so much like a strong program in cultural sociology, because from their perspective, and especially how Isaac Reed implemented certain parts in his book on interpretation of social knowledge, the most important is the particular case which we want to understand through diverse material and social aspects of social field and so on, the things we investigate. So the question, what determines what, is not important as far as it's not useful for understanding the case. So I'm picking up, in my dissertation, I was choosing books not because they were the most brilliant written books in Czech Republic, but because I thought, okay, this is very interesting because they help me to understand this particular phenomenon which I'm interested in. And that might be a book which is written in a very bad way, like 50 Shades of Grey. And Eva Illus wrote a sociological study on this book, that it's a really terrible style, but it tells us something very important about, no, I mean, we can, I would say now we can objectively say that it's very, but I tried to read it. No, sorry. But it tells us something very important about contemporary societies and their sexuality. So it's not about book being so brilliant and intellectually valuable and so on. It's not the condition, I would say. Yeah, we are talking now for almost 2 hours, so maybe it's time to wrap it up if you don't have any urgent questions. And yeah, I want to thank you again. It was, and I still feel like we are somehow like still touching the different surfaces. So it would need another discussion. But yeah, we'll see. Thanks a lot for participating, especially regarding the time shift, but it's not that late in Sydney. And yeah, I would love to invite you for our Sociology of Literature panel at the conference, but it will be in Czech, so unfortunately. And greetings to Angelika Tumala, who was watching us on YouTube. So
I wanted to thank you because I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think it's really just the beginning. As you said, we be touching different surfaces, and I think we could go on for several more hours. So let's do that in some form.
Maybe in person at some point in time.
Yes, that would be nice.